If you look at the label on a bottle of cordial, it'll tell you to dilute the taste. What I want to talk about today is the crucifixion of Christ and the death and resurrection that are the main hinge points for Christianity. A lot of our interpretation or our impressions, our mental picture when we talk about crucifixion and the crucifixion have been stemmed from contemporary art, and a lot of that has taken the facts, the realities, and has diluted them down to make it more to our taste, more palatable to the eye, more palatable to our own sensitivities. But in doing so, and I'm not saying that the art has necessarily been in any way deliberately done that way to deflect attention, but the unfortunate side effect of it is that we have got a diluted opinion, and therefore I feel society has lost a degree of empathetic and sympathetic understanding of what actually took place 2,000 years ago. First thing I need to say is, with regards to crucifixion, it wasn't sanitised. It was barbaric in the extreme, and I don't even think barbaric is a strong enough word. We're told in scripture, but we're also told by contemporary writers of the time, such as Josephus and Eusebius, who recorded quite a considerable bit of what was happening in Jerusalem at that time, including the crucifixion that we know to be the crucifixion of Christ. And we know that from their writings that actually back up what we read in the Bible. For example, the scourging of Christ. Wrong interpretation of the reality is that we think Christ was the only one that was scourged. This isn't correct. Anybody who was going for crucifixion was scourged. The whole point of the scourging, it was again scientific, and this is something you're going to see in this little chat, is the science behind the most barbaric execution of people. And scourging was part of that scientific process. The point of scourging was to facilitate but not cause death. In other words, it was to cause such a severe amount of injuries and bodily trauma that in reality the person was probably beyond paramedic help, but not to the point where the injuries themselves would have caused death, certainly not immediately, because crucifixion, you better remember, was a public spectacle. It was there to be enjoyed by the rather morbid passers-by, and we look at some of the realities that allowed that to happen and enabled that to happen. But the scourging itself was carried out with a specific implement designed for that purpose. It served no other purpose other than to cause the injuries that scourging would cause. It's called a flagellum, and it was basically a whip with maybe 3 or 4 braided strands to it, braided leather strands, and into those braids were woven little sharp things, whether it be a piece of bone, some flint, a bit of metal, whatever it might have been. But the whole point was that they were designed to cut. Not cut to the point that there would have been massive blood loss, but cut to the point of shredding the skin severely enough to cause a high degree of agony and pain and blood loss, but also to damage the back muscles, which were the predominant area that the scourging whip would have hit, simply because the back tissues on a human being are the deepest tissues on the body, so they can be cut quite severely without necessarily getting right through to cause massive medical implications. But each strand would have had maybe 3 or 4 sharp implements, so every time the person was struck, that strike with the flagellum could have caused anywhere between, say, 12 and 16 or maybe more quite severe lacerations, maybe, I don't know, half a centimetre deep, maybe a centimetre deep, but very deep enough, and certainly deep enough to cause agony. This scourging was also carried out by the Romans. It wasn't carried out by the Jews, it was carried out by the Romans, who weren't governed by Jewish law, that made it maximum of 39 strikes with the whip. These guys were specialists, and this is something that's worth remembering, that these soldiers who carried out the scourging and the executions, yes, they were soldiers, but they were specialists within the military ranks. Their job, their specialism being the execution of prisoners. They knew how to prolong the agony. They knew how to maximise pain and maximise the whole spectacle for the public to watch. And it was their masterpiece. So they really took great pride, if that can be such a word, in the circumstances. They really were specialists at making this as effective within their realm as it could be. So when it came to actually scourging someone, they would have scourged that person based upon their height, size, weight, age, all the things that would have been limiting factors. So they didn't kill them. They just wounded them severely enough that when they would take them to the cross, the agony on the cross would be maximised. It's all scientific, and it's part of the ethos of the Roman Empire that needs to be remembered if you're going to understand what was taking place at the time and some of the realities. This scourging would have been carried out, male or female, didn't matter, front and rear. The condemned prisoner was also a play toy for the soldiers, who would have taken quite a delight in being able to vent off some of their own frustrations on the condemned prisoner. And we know this again from historical writings, but we know that Christ himself was beaten by the soldiers. But again, understanding that that beating wasn't just a couple of slaps round the head. He was given a kicking. He was given a kicking which in itself would have recalled any one of us to ring for an ambulance here in modern society. Not good, real beating, probably teeth missing, but torn, black eyes, busted lips, kicked anywhere else around the body. He was given a hiding. To add insult to injury, they then jammed a crown of thorns on his head. Now, I've actually brought a crown of thorns home from Israel and had to carry it home, and those thorns are sharp. I was like a pin cushion by the time I got home. They're that sharp and they're that long. They're about, I don't know, 5 centimetres long, thereabouts. But in order to get the crown of thorns onto his head, they couldn't put it on by hand. They had to force it on with sticks and actually jam it down onto his head. So you can understand that before he even left to walk to Golgotha to be actually crucified, Jesus wasn't the 6 foot tall, serene, clean looking individual that we see in a lot of the contemporary art. He was a bloodied mess. Physically, emotionally, medically. He was a mess. There was none of this nice, tall, serene, pale-skinned individual standing serenely while they undress him. That's that's nonsense. He was a mess. To carry his cross, the art would generally depict that it was the finished cross. It was the upright plus the crossbeam. This is not accurate. This is not historically correct. What would have been carried would have been the crossbeam, because the uprights were in permanent place. Golgotha was the place of execution. It wasn't just a convenient, let's step them outside the gate and do it here. It was a place of execution. The uprights were permanently fixed. So we carried the crossbeam. The crossbeam itself could have weighed, I don't know, 60 kilos, 70 kilos. The weight of an average human being. Well, not this one. But you can understand the physical state that he would have been in. That, and not just Christ, but quite a few other people. That the carrying of that cross could have been upwards on impossible for someone. That's why it was a Roman thing to press gang somebody from the passer-by to carry the physical cross, the crossbeam, to the place of execution on behalf of the prisoner. And in the case of Christ, it was Simon of Cyrene, who I'm actually named after. So when they get them there, again the art would depict Christ standing majestically, sort of gazing at the sky in wonderment, as they ceremoniously and rather in a dignified way remove his outer garments. Crap. He was a mess, he was a bloodied heap, and he was stripped naked. There was no loincloth. This is, again, probably just a decency thing from the perspective of the art and the artists, that they adorned any imagery of the crucified Christ with a loincloth. In reality, condemned prisoners who were being crucified were hung naked, and there was no dignity left for them at all in any shape, fashion or form. So over and above the bloodied heap that was dragged there in the first place, it was now naked as well. Hey, yeah. And that male or female didn't matter. They were hung naked. The crucifixion itself at the place of death, the prisoner would have not been terribly hard to force to the ground. laid across the crossbeam with their arms probably tied at the elbows, maybe at the forearms as well, and a nail driven through roughly where you can just above where my wristwatch strap is. That's where the joint of the ulna and the radial bones meet, and there's the rest of the wrist. Not enough to cause death, missing the artery, because again they wanted to prolong the spectacle. You've got to remember the whole point of this was to prolong agony, make it a spectacle, make it fun for those watching. That would have effectively left the prisoner hanging on their forearms. The crossbeam had to be put into place then, and it had to be lifted up and attached to the upright. I'm not sure what means, but what we do know is that they didn't bring scaffolding with them in order to hoist this up into a massive height away up here, as would be the depiction in this crowd where the feet of Christ are maybe 7 or 8 feet in the air. In reality, it would have been lifted on the hands of the guards. The executioners would have picked him up and hung the crossbeam. Now that puts Christ's head probably about here, about just above my own head height, not too far off it. And the crucifixion would have taken place at the side of the road, somewhere like that. Albeit it was a public road, it was a public place, it was very, very public. Again, what's the purpose of this? Keep in mind, as I said before, the public spectacle. We're better to further humiliate a condemned prisoner than to have them within physical touching distance and physical spitting distance of passers-by. And we know that this took place again with the chronicle writings that took place, or that were written by the people who were there at the time. And their reasons for writing a lot of these chronicles I'll come to in a moment. The notice that was put above Christ's head then, this wasn't unique to Jesus either. This was something that was done, it was a matter of routine as well. That this condemned prisoner would have been lifted up onto the cross and a notice put above their head to tell everybody what they'd done wrong, so that they could be verbally abused. So that's the reality, is that they would have been stuck at the side of the road. They wouldn't have been up on the big green hill far away. That's a wee bit of a fanciful dream, to be honest. But having been lifted up on the crossbeam and the crossbeam attached, their feet would then have been lifted slightly so that their knees were bent. And this is important to understand the nature and the science behind what took place in a crucifixion. Their knees would have been bent and their feet then nailed to a plinth which would have been attached somewhere on the upright of the cross, a little step. The reason for this is the death of a crucifixion. What causes death? It wasn't blood loss. When your body is held in this position and it's hard for your chest and shoulders to move, especially when you feel suspended on it, it's actually quite hard for your lungs to operate. The net result is that you struggle for breath. What's actually happening is that your lungs are starting to fill up with bodily fluids. Now the only way they could alleviate this was to stand upright, to take the pressure off their arms, thereby rubbing their already slashed back up against the rough cross, which had probably been used for I don't know how many executions beforehand, so the contents of that alone would have caused severe enough infection that death would have happened at some point in the future. So we know that the lungs were filling up with fluid, and this is important to remember because it comes to great relevance when we deal with the question of whether Christ died or not. But the circumstances of the cross, the circumstances of the crucifixion were that it was a public spectacle, very public, very humiliating, very agonising, and there was no distance between the condemned prisoner and passers-by. They could hurl verbal abuse, they could punch, kick, spit, and the soldiers would have just considered this part of their entertainment as well. Obviously they wouldn't have been allowed to attempt to get the body off the cross until the person was dead, and that's where we come back to the specialism of the soldiers. Because these guys were specialists, and people who turn around and say that Christ didn't die on the cross, A, they don't know soldiers, they don't know military specialism either, and they don't understand the Roman Empire. The Romans were notorious for being brutal, not just to peasants and to citizenry, but also to their own military. And although they didn't use it terribly often, there was a thing that they did employ called the decimation. Wasn't used too often, but basically they took 10% of a military unit that had got it wrong, and they killed them. They were beaten to death by the other 90% of that military unit. And they didn't do it too often because it doesn't take long before you have too many 10%s taken out, you have no soldiers left. But it gives you an indication of the brutality and the severity of Roman punishment. And it was no different for these guys either. So when these specialists were looking at the death of Christ, hi guys,
Hi.
they would have been looking at the reality was that if they got it wrong, they would have faced the same execution. Remember that these were specialists. They understood the agony that they were inflicting. They understood the severity of what they were inflicting. And they understood the ability that they had to make this execution last for days. And it's worth noting Christ died in a matter of hours on the cross. It wasn't uncommon for people to take 4 or 5 days on the cross. Nailed. No dignity. No ability to clean themselves if they had to go to the loo. No ability to fight back in any way at their aggressors or at their abusers. But the death of Christ itself by these specialists, because they were specialists, they knew what death looked like. They also knew how to inflict death. And we know this again to be scripturally correct, because whenever the Sanhedrin wanted the people dead quickly in order to get Passover started, they came along to the 2 prisoners who were on either side of Christ, and they broke their legs, broke their femurs in order to make them hang on their arms, and thereby make it impossible for them to stand up and get a breath, thereby hastening the asphyxiation by bodily fluid, which is what crucifixion was. To do that, it's a fairly substantial weapon they have to use, and it's not fun to swing. It's a big, heavy sort of maul. But their specialism, they looked at Christ, they thought, yep, that looks like someone who's gone, they're dead. But to confirm it, they used again their own specialist knowledge, and they pierced him with a spear in the lung. And we're told that there was 1 drop of blood, which would have been nothing more than capillary bleeding, followed by a flow of water, which would have been the bodily fluids that had filled up and effectively asphyxiated Jesus on the cross. So we know from those records, from the specialism of the soldiers, Jesus was dead. There was no heartbeat. He was gone. If there had been a heartbeat, there would have been more than just a drop of blood. There would have been a flow of blood. He was dead. So we know that Jesus died. That's that lie debunked. Jesus did die on the cross. One of the things which is noteworthy about Christ's conduct on the cross is actually a fulfillment of a prophecy in Isaiah. And again, this is documented not in the Bible, but through the writings of Josephus and Eusebius. Because the person on the cross was completely vulnerable, the only way they had to try and ward off any attacker, verbal attacker or mocker or otherwise, was through verbal recourse back again. And it was one of the curios of the time was to record the expletives issued from the cross or from the condemned prisoner on the cross. A bit like Victorian death masks that used to be all the vogue. And it's noted, and this is one of the reasons why Josephus and Eusebius made note of the fact that this should have been just a normal execution, a normal crucifixion, but this Jesus chap said very little. He didn't come out with the normal expletives that we'd anticipated from someone on the cross. He was almost silent, obviously only speaking to the 1 or 2 that were at his sort of emotional level, as it his mother and the other followers who had made their way towards the cross. When he told, John, look after my mother, mother, look after John, that type of thing. He was virtually silent, as by Isaiah's prophecy that they led the lamb silent to the slaughter. That woke a few people up, and again, that's just a wee reality that some people have overlooked and maybe aren't fully aware of. So he died on the cross. The next thing we've got to look at is when people turn around and say, yeah, but they took his body and they hid it to make it look like it was resurrected. First question, who's they? Because they can fall into one of 3 different groups. Either the Romans, or the Sanhedrin, or the Apostles. Now, why would the Romans and the Sanhedrin have taken Christ's body? Contrary to what was written in Scripture, contrary to what was written in some of the other chronicles at the time, the only reason they would have taken the body, if they had taken it, which they didn't, would have been to debunk the claim that Christ had made even before he died, that he would rise in 3 days. Now, if on the 4th day they'd produced the body, that's the argument debunked. They didn't produce the body, because they didn't take it. That's that one eliminated. Nothing difficult about that. So that leaves the Apostles. No, they must have stolen it to prove a point. I've met many, many brave people in my time who have stepped in front of imminent danger to defend the truth and to defend the vulnerable. I've never yet met anyone who will voluntarily put themselves in harm's way for something they know to be a lie. So I don't accept that the apostles did it. And here's my reason. Every single one of the apostles, and this isn't written in the Bible, it's written in other chronicles, every single one of the apostles and others were executed for professing the resurrection of Christ. Now, I don't care who you are or how brave or tough you think you are. Nobody is going to, or very few people that I can think of, unless there's something wrong with them, will turn around and say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and die for something I know to be lies. So the lie is out the window, that's gone. There's the fact that there was over 500 people, some of them independent, never even met each other, quite a few of them I would suspect, who still professed that they had seen the resurrected Christ. And many of them were executed and murdered. We know what Nero and others did in relation to Christians, dipping them in tar and using them as torches for their feasts, rather than, and they went to their deaths rather than tell a lie, rather than admit to or profess that Christ was actually alive. They went to death professing his resurrection. Not that he was alive somewhere else or hiding somewhere else, but that he was dead and had risen from the dead. That was their testimony, and they were prepared to die for it. Some of the excuses that people have brought up in the past, oh, they were all delusional. Now, I've met some weird people in my time. I have yet to meet 500 independent people who can all delusionally feel the same thing and say the same thing and come up with testimony that corroborates each other, even though they've never met. So that's crap as well. Christ died on the cross. We've looked at that. And Christ rose from the dead. That was witnessed and testified to by people who were prepared to accept death. He was ascended into heaven. That was witnessed by the same people, or by some of the same people, who themselves went and were executed the same way Christ was, with all that agony and with everything else. And we know this is documented. For something that other people would say was a delusion or a lie. I don't accept that. I just don't. Christ died. Christ rose from the dead. Christ ascended to heaven. And he's coming back. When? I don't know. I can't be certain. I can be certain of one thing. It's an awful lot sooner than some people realise. An awful lot sooner. I wouldn't say that we're on the final chapter of the book. I would say we're in the last page. The season. What we see around us, the prophetic fulfilments that have been taking place and are still taking place, are still fulfilling as we speak. They just all point to it. They're all converging. It's like roads. It's like lanes on the motorway when you've got the cones out. You can see the road converging. But if you're in the back seat reading a comic, you'll not see what's happening. And unfortunately, most of Christendom are sitting in the back seat reading a comic. They're oblivious to what's actually happening in front of them. And that's not a condemnation of them. It's actually a sadder reflection on a church which has allowed the message of Christ to be diluted down to make it more palatable for modern society. Instead of taking modern society and giving it a shake and saying, wake up. That's all I've got to say about that. All I want to do was just examine the reality of crucifixion. That sanitized, watered down, diluted reality that we've been fed. And I wanted to give you some of the, again, verifiable realities of military life, Roman life, and the historical realities of what took place after Christ's resurrection to the people that profess that resurrection. Because I think they do substantially debunk some of the excuses that are used by deniers with regards to it. The death and resurrection of Christ is the lynch point. It is the hinge of all Christianity. And for some people in modern Christendom to deny that Christ died or that Christ rose from the dead, I'm sorry, but if you profess that, you're not a Christian. Because the whole thing of Christianity is that resurrection. The penalty that was paid for by Christ was a penalty I can't pay and you can't pay. Sin was brought into the world by man. Man had to take it out. And God nominated his own Son, his own spoken word, to become a man and to pay the penalty in a way that no other human being could possibly pay, in a way that could not be defeated and could not be denied. And you can ignore it, but it's like ignoring the brake light in your car. It's your life, destroy it if you wish, but the reality is that he's coming back. And not only do we need to get ready, but we maybe need to stop hiding ourselves away and start getting other people ready too. So when you celebrate Easter this year, and you celebrate Passover, remember what it's about. It's not about a stupid chocolate egg. It's about the Passover. It's about the celebration that the Hebrews were released from Egypt. The Last Supper, as we talk about, was the last meal that Jesus had with his disciples. It was, I'm assuming, the last Passover meal that he was ever going to serve and have with his people. So when you have your egg, which is reminiscent of the egg of new birth, that's part of the Seder meal, remember what it's supposed to be about. It's not Smarties. When you have communion, if you have communion, remember what that communion represents. The unleavened bread, no yeast. The cleansing of the house, no yeast. Cleanse your house. Do your best, because that's all Christ ever asks of you. Do your best to cleanse your house, to make it a house fit for him to live in. So that when you have communion, you're not only sharing in the purification of your body, but you're sharing and acknowledging in the sacrifice and the agony of that sacrifice that Christ carried out on your behalf. That when he died and said it is finished, he was unlocking the door to allow anyone to walk through that door who chose to walk through the door. But it's your responsibility to turn the handle. He's not going to turn it for you. You want in? Open the door and walk in. Happy Passover. Shalom.